Welcome to this debate on the green transition in Europe and how it can affect jobs and businesses. For a decade almost now, the green transition and climate has been the talk of the town all across Europe and the rest of the world, and how we can reduce CO2 emissions. Many treaties, many agreements, some countries more enthusiastic about it than others. And this summer may have given us a good indication of what could happen if nothing happens. Heat waves and droughts all across the world have... Am I the only one who hears a... Okay. Have had huge impacts in sectors such as agriculture, transport, energy. And on top of all this, there's a war going on in Ukraine. There's rising inflation, increasing shortage of goods and products, and a new economic world order in which trade and nations' relations may be also impacting jobs and growth. But not all countries and regions are affected equally. There are many opinions on how to get to the goal without losing public support. There's a huge divide between north and south, east and west, and depending on which type of workforce, energy consumption, main industries that you have. So in short, we all want the same result, but there are going to be winners and losers in the green transition, and you can't pay your bills or put food on the table with good green intentions. And this leads us to this debate and why we're here, and I would like to welcome the panel, starting with Judith Kirton-Darling. Great name.
Thank you.
You were elected twice as for the European Parliament for Labour in England, but Brexit and all that jazz kind of put an end to that in 2020. Mm-hmm. Since then, you have been the Deputy General Secretary for Industry All Europe, which is a federation of 180 trade unions representing 7 million workers, quite a lot, in 38 European countries. And you cover sectors such as mining, textile, metal, and others. Mm-hmm. Welcome, Judith.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Laura Klitgaard, you have a background in engineering, and for the past 3 months, you've been the chairman of the Danish Society of Engineers, 140,000 highly skilled members, primarily in engineering and IT.
Yeah, and also natural sciences. Yeah.
And before this, you worked at one of the largest, maybe the largest consultancy company. We can get back to that in just a minute.
True.
COVI, and you were also more or less on your old home turf, Mariager.
Yeah.
Where you worked for.
Before I worked in COVI, I used to work in this municipality, so I was part of renovating this building, actually.
Doesn't get more local than that.
No, so I just took a round before I started up, just watching if they're taking good care of it, and they are.
And that brings us to the last participant, Søren Adamsen, Senior Vice President and Executive Market Director at COVI. Is it the largest or one of the largest consultancy firms in Denmark?
I think our good colleagues in Rambøll may challenge us if we say we are the largest. I just go for the best.
Okay.
I think that's the alternative.
I think they'll challenge you on that as well.
COVI has approximately 7,000 people working across the world, and you are experts in various sectors such as construction, energy, transportation, and with a focus on sustainable solutions. Welcome all. The first round of this debate is about setting the framework for this, an overall view on how the climate ambitions and the way forward based on a green strategy. We hear voices now starting to say that it's too ambitious and the whole European Fit for 55 strategy needs to slow down because, energy is short. Should we start coal mining again? Should we increase nuclear power? So a question for all of you actually, how do you see the ambition targets in the Fit for 55 framework? And do you see a way to turn the green transition into an alternative European growth model, and maybe even cushion energy crisis and the recession? Let's start with Judith.
Yeah, well, I guess from our perspective, this is a really extremely complicated situation because it's taken us many years in the trade union movement to get to the point where representing workers from the coal mining sector right through oil and gas to the automotive sector to maybe some of the big obvious winners of the green transition in renewable energy and in the circular economy. The previous panels, it was quite striking in the circular economy discussion, didn't mention the vast number of jobs which can be created through a stronger circular economy. So there are winning sectors, if you like. There are more challenging sectors which are going to undergo enormous transformation, and there are sectors which will disappear out of our economy. And over the last few years within the trade union movement, we've had a really deep process of coming together to have a common agenda about how to handle this, because we know where we have to go to. The science is very clear. We have a climate crisis, and we know that this decade is the crucial decade. But now we're in a very contradictory situation where mining workers in countries like Germany have negotiated massive coal phase-out agreements. We're in negotiations in Poland for the coal phasing out. We have 100,000 coal miners in Poland, and we've been negotiating now for several years on coal phase-out agreements. And with the war in Ukraine and the energy price crisis, suddenly those workers who have been told, you are yesterday's industry, are now being told, no, we have to put that just transition plan on ice. We need you to go back into the mines, and we're opening coal mines which were considered to be economically inefficient and inactive. We have the same right across Europe. In Estonia this morning on my phone, the news was that the oil shale workers are being told their transition plan is on hold. We need the oil shale because of the gas price. So we're in an extremely contradictory situation for workers with a lot of uncertainty about the way forward. But I think the absolutely critical point is there is no business as usual anymore. So there's nothing about standing still which will give us a step forward. And we know where we have to get to by 2050. We have to reach climate neutrality. And this decade is the vital decade for investment. Half of Europe's steel blast furnaces will need to be renovated or replaced this decade. A third of chemical crackers, a third of cement kilns. So if we're not making those investments, those strategic investments in foundation industries right now, then actually we're saying that what we're promoting is deindustrialization in Europe, and that will be devastating for our economy. And we've seen with the pandemic, my last point, why there's no business as usual. The pandemic has exposed how vulnerable you are if you rely on global supply chains. If there's anything that we've seen around what's happened in terms of prices and in terms of the economic situation we're in, largely it's because we've become far too dependent on global supply chains. So we actually need to reindustrialize Europe, but we need to use this opportunity to reindustrialize in a way which is targeting those long-term objectives, circular economy, climate neutrality by 2050, and having clear pathways, bringing people with us, telling the story of that transformation and supporting the transformation for those workers who are impacted, giving them the power so that people aren't recipients of political or industrial decisions, but they're actors. That's what workers across Europe want. They want to be the actors in their own destiny. They don't want to receive orders about which way we're moving. So that's why we developed, as an industrial federation, a plan of how we see a just transition agenda for Europe, which is about putting people right at the front of the transition agenda.
We're going to come back to that, but can you just briefly tell us how you mentioned that you brought all these different workers' unions together from different sectors?
It's not easy.
That was my point, because I mean, these challenges have been obvious for many years. why is it that it's been so hard to bring these people together?
Well, part of it is that we're, as humans, we're quite resistant to change often. And if you are in a community which has been based around a certain industry and your whole community is based around that industry, the idea of radical change is actually really worrying and creates a lot of uncertainty. And what many in the debate, we've had a period where there were very simplistic answers given. We would hear green NGOs, for example, say, well, you can move from coal to renewable energy. But often the jobs which exist in coal are in different regions from the jobs which will be created in renewable energy. You're talking about radical social change. And it's far more sexy, if you like, and I think that was shown by the previous panels. It's far more sexy to talk about technological change and to talk about industrial technology and new processes and new products than to talk about the real nuts and bolts of social change, where you have to have processes of negotiation, you have to engage people, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy, it's not cost-free. But that process is what we've been engaged in, and we have some good examples of where those negotiations have been undertaken, sometimes in surprising places. Some of the best examples are actually in Spain, and then we have examples in some of the Nordic countries of very wide societal negotiations about agreements, because countries like Finland have climate neutrality targets for much earlier than other countries. So in Finland, climate neutrality should be by 2035. This is like a colossal social change. They've done it with very negotiated roundtables at every level, regional, industrial, and bringing people to the table to agree. It's only in that way that you can negotiate. But to do that, you need strong and stable industrial relations, and we don't have that all the way across Europe. You're very lucky in Denmark with the welfare system and the industrial relations system you have, but go to Slovakia, where trade unions are under enormous attack, and talk about the transition. It's a completely different discussion. So at European level, we're trying to build that solidarity between workers, to support the well-organized, supporting the poorly supported at national level, because we can't do it alone. No country can deliver this alone, and the weakest link will be, will undermine the whole process. So we need to work collectively. Europe's extremely important in this challenge.
Laura, over to you, and the overall general question about how you see the targets in the European targets with Fit for 55, and how do you turn this whole thing into a plus, even though it's, for these past months, looks kind of negative?
Yeah, I strongly agree with Judith. It's a lot of processes that need to come together, and for where we stand, the green transition is, of course, a necessity. I come from a trade union, and we have many members who still work in areas that we don't see as part of the green transition, of course, and it's sometimes difficult to go out and say, we want a green transition, but still I want to be your union, I want to speak for you, and that can be hard to do both. But I think that takes us to a place where we need to talk about, like, what can the green transition then bring to your job possibilities, both here in Denmark, but on a European scale. That there will be many jobs in this area, but of course it takes for people's minds to move somewhere else, and to trust actually also the politicians to say that this is where we're going, this is what we want to do, this is the future. And as a supplement to you, Judith, about what could we do during the pandemic, we've seen that politicians can actually be pretty radical in their decision making. But apparently this is not enough of a crisis yet to be that progressive. Even though, of course, I know there are a lot of politicians where it's on the top of their agenda, but like if we see it as an overall. And then, of course, the war in Ukraine, we can't get out of talking about that one as well, because it has shown us how vulnerable we are, but also why we need these new technologies, because we're way too dependent on old technology and old energy sources. But from our point of view, it's a matter of how do we stay relevant for the members who work in oil, for example, but maybe they want to transition into working in the wind industry. How do we support them in the best way? And that's, of course, a challenge in these years, because we are standing right at the tipping point. So for our point of view, that's very important.
And Søren, over to you, because I guess that even though Judith says that no business as usual business, and you have to more or less navigate through all of this, at the same time you have this big firm who are delivering a lot of these solutions that we need in the future. How do you, from COVI, see, well, the status as it is right now, where you have the political ambitions and goals, but you also have reality, which is economic.
I think the situation is we have seen a number of CEOs being sacked because they didn't meet their profit targets. We haven't seen very many being sacked because they didn't meet the sustainability targets.
Exactly.
So evidently there is a certain short-term focus here. Having said that, I think it's fairly evident that in Europe we had a fairly good plan. We wanted to base ourselves on gas as the transition fuel, and then over time we would gradually increase the amount of renewables in our energy mix. And then came the black swan with the Russian invasion, and now we are into a situation that is difficult, and that is a crisis. I think, though, that Churchill said you should never waste a good crisis. And I think that is the situation we're in right now. Evidently, Fit for 55 is ambitious. But I also think now is the time to show political leadership and dare to believe in the targets that was created. Personally, and as a company as well, I'm absolutely sure that what we're looking into is something that's disruptive. And I think if we are to compare to something, it's the disruptiveness that we saw with the coming of semiconductors and computers back in the 80s and the 90s. And I think what that showed you was that you could either embrace or try to flee from that. And I think it's fairly evident that in Europe we tried to flee, we didn't embrace it enough. And what happened today? Today we have a situation where technology is based and the big tech companies are based anywhere but in Europe. So therefore I think political leadership is going to be the essence here. We need to believe in the road that's set. And we need to move in that direction. And then, as Judith said, it's going to have consequences, and we'll need to cope with these consequences. And I think if not we cope with these consequences, then we will have situations like the American president election back in, when was it, 16 or something like that, where you will see that people who try to talk into what was in the future will win, instead of the ones talking into what is people talking into the past will win over the ones trying to talk into the future.
The political leadership that you were talking about is put down in words in the Fit for 55, and it says that they want to reduce CO2 emissions by at least 55% in the next 8 years, 7.5 years by now. You at COVI, with these goals and ambitions here in relation to this plan, what are your prospects of doing businesses in this area? Because, I mean, do you do whatever you do independently of what politicians decide, Europe, Copenhagen, and elsewhere, because you have the shoes set up in advance and you can go ahead?
No, we are very much affected by the political decisions, not just in Europe, but in North America as well. However, as a company, you also have to take your own stance. And we came out with a new strategy earlier this year, where we basically decided to shy away from all fossil projects. And that comes with a price. I think it's 200-300 million Danish kroners. We overnight sort of said, okay, we're going to live without that. But that is the price for us to put ourselves in a position where we, to clients, but also to employees, is an interesting place to work for and work with.
Okay. Laura, in the Danish debate, a huge part of the Danish green transition comes from technologies that haven't really been invented yet. I don't remember the percentage, but it was a pretty big chunk that says our goal comes from things that we don't know yet, more or less. And it's more or less your members who are supposed to come up with these ideas. How do you see this challenge?
Yeah, no pressure, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's not long ago that I worked in COVID and you came out with your strategy, and I was like, so what does this mean for my day job? Like, am I doing the right thing? How do I fit in here in such a green strategy? It's not that I think we all as employees, we saw the possibilities in the strategy, but we were like, do we need to invent something new? Do I need to behave in a new way? And of course, it does take something from the ones that has to deliver, and that's actually the engineers on the floor, to say it like that. So it is pressure on our member group, but we have a lot of greatly skilled engineers, both here in Denmark, but also in the rest of Europe. So I do have faith that a lot of technologies will be better and will be developed. The problem is, at least in Denmark, that we would like to, from our side, push the politicians to open up for more engineers to be educated, instead of moving schools around. And that there's a big political discussion in that. We just see a very big lack of engineers, and if we calculate forward, it's only going to be worse. So if we lack the people who are going to invent the technologies, who are going to work in this sector, who are going to move everything, and the same thing with laborers, like who's going to build it? So it's like, sometimes when you make a political decision, it's easy to say, so we're going to set a goal, and now we set the goal and it's a great goal. Yeah, well, we all agree, that's wonderful. But who are the people bringing us to that goal? Because there are a lot of technologies, a lot of things you can do, but somebody has to do it. And that's where we see a problem, that there's not enough somebodies. So yeah, for us politically, that's very important, that we open up for more engineers being educated, but also the possibility to move across borders and help each other in Europe.
But that whole thing about shortage of labor is not isolated to engineering.
Not at all.
You can go to schools, hospitals, whatever. So that's also a big part of it. But as you said, you set the goals and you have the ambitions. For all of you, are the ambitions too high at this point? Judith?
I think we have to be realistic that if we're aiming in effectively, for some industries, one investment cycle, the length of kind of life of some of the equipment means that the investments now will be to 2050. So if we know where we want to get to in 2050, then we have two choices. We either try and have a kind of emissions reduction which is as kind of gradual as possible to 2050, or we delay, and then we know further on the emissions reduction will be extremely sharp and brutal if we're going to get to 2050. So I think having that kind of plan is really important. That's why the trade union movement have backed the Fit for 55 package, but with one really important condition, which is that those climate ambitions have to have a strong social counterpart to them. Because of exactly the point that Laura's just said, what we see is that we have an extremely strong binding hard law telling us how many greenhouse gas emissions you need to have for a steel mill, for a chemical works, for a cement works, but we don't have any kind of plan for how you deal with the social change which is coming. So it's all voluntary cooperation, industry focused around the skills agenda. It's all based on kind of coalitions of the willing, to use a military analogy, and that just won't cut it. The scale of, we are on the brink where we're actually already into an industrial revolution. And if we don't recognize that that is a social revolution as well, and we don't put in place the social package which is needed, then that will become the Achilles heel of the climate ambition, because we won't have, at the moment, across Europe, we have, as a result of the Ukraine war, a big European package called Repower EU, which is about reducing our dependence on Russian gas and oil and coal. Lots of that is about installation of solar, the development of other renewables, but the biggest blockage is we don't have installers. We have massive skills gaps in some of the key sectors, skilled workers, semi-skilled workers, right across the whole of the economy. And that's before you start talking about the rest of like logistics and the truck drivers shortages and all the other shortages in the economy. So we need to have a far stronger plan about how we manage this social transition. And that means no country, like I said, can do it alone. You have to have a European level plan. We have countries where there are massive skills shortages, particularly in North and West Europe. We have countries where we have high youth unemployment. So why aren't we thinking as a continent of something like after the Second World War in the US, you had the GI Act, which was basically you give the opportunity to young people to train up in a skill which is going to be a future skill. Why aren't we thinking of a European GI Act linked to the Green Deal, which basically trains up those workers, those young people, gives them an opportunity? And the second thing is that we have a lot of sites, because of the Ukraine crisis and the energy price crisis. We now have sites like this week in Slovakia, 3,000 aluminium workers have been told that they will be sacked because a big smelter, a Norsk Hydro smelter, will close because of the energy price crisis. Why aren't we using the crisis to basically keep people close, use short-time working schemes, keep people close to the strategic industries that we will need in the future, because we're going to need a lot of aluminium in the future for lots of the green tech that we're talking about. We keep them close, but we use the time when it's too expensive to turn the equipment to train people up, to upskill them, to reskill them. We're not imaginative about the social dimension, and that's where we really need some strategic and good planning, and industrial policy at European level, and a lot more political will.
And you are more or less just starting the next part of it, which is about, what do we do, winners and losers in the short. But just let me finish this one off with Laura and Søren. The ambitions in today's reality, are they too ambitious?
I think they have to be ambitious. Like, we don't have a choice. To me, it's like, if you must know that as well, Søren. If you're a company, for example, and you don't have high expectations for yourself and set high ambitions, then you might as well don't. Like, it's not gonna move anything if you're not ambitious. So we might not make it. Like, that's just how it is. But we're not gonna move anywhere if we're not very ambitious.
Søren?
I fully agree, and I think what will happen is that on the short-term level, what we're going to face within the next 2 or 3 years is that the emissions will increase because we are kicking coal back into the energy systems. But that doesn't change the fact that we should keep the ambitions. And I think Fit for 55 is an excellent ambition. I think we should keep it there. And then when we are in 30, whether it's 52 or 55 or 58 is probably not the important bit. The important bit is to drive the development. And if we don't do it, then the Americans or the Asians are going to win again.
Okay. Let's start on the new winners and losers part of this, because, and this goes for Søren and Laura, Danes, especially Danish politicians, see ourselves as the green champions of the world. Are we right?
Good question.
I'm not sure we are the green champions of the world. I was in Netherlands just before summer holidays, and I saw some things there just as ambitious and just as good as what we are doing. I think overall, northwestern Europe is probably where most people are looking for inspiration. Whether we are better than the Swedes or the Dutch or the Germans or the British, I don't know. But I think we are a part of the world where people are looking for inspiration. That's the situation, and the Finnish are going with even more radical ambitions than we are right now.
Laura?
Yeah, and I think for some years now it's kind of been a part of the Danish mindset, just as a regular citizen. A lot of Danish citizens think about the environment, and some of course more than others, but it is kind of a thing that it goes out into our whole society. And then of course there's a political side to that as well. But I think it is in general important to a regular Dane that we do think about these things and we do try to solve this problem. So in that way, I think Denmark is one of the countries where it means the most to a lot of citizens.
And this brings me to you because you have it in color, I have it in...
Yeah.
But there's a lot of, I think it's called demands in here, and some of it is about tackling new skills and right to equality, training, lifelong learning, and so on. This sounds very Danish, I guess, also. But when you listen to Danish hopes and dreams on this whole green transition, which is happening, both when you listen to it here or in Brussels, as Søren said, this is maybe not just Danish, but Northwest European kind of thing, representing Poland, Slovakia, Spain, Italy. What do you think is going to be the challenges here?
You know what? I think this is such a big challenge, and there are so many different pieces to the puzzle to get us to these broader objectives, that there's actually the opportunity for everybody to be a leader, but we're not all leaders in everything. So if you're aiming to be the green leader, then you're destined to fail. I mean, just go home right now. But I would say Denmark is, if you like, the green leader when it comes to wind. It's clear that the wind industry and what's been done and the choices which have been made have been really strategic. Other countries will be, Norway is setting itself up to be the leader in CCS, carbon capture storage technology. They see that as their strategic, long-term kind of economic interest. Another country will be the leader in hydrogen. Sweden wants to be the leader in green steel, carbon-free steel, and they're doing it. I mean, there are crazy things happening in the north of Sweden where nobody lives and nobody ever goes and the sun never rises. But it's Klondike up there in terms of the mining industry and the steel industry and batteries and so on. Equally, there are opportunities elsewhere. So one of the really interesting things, if you're looking at the energy sector and energy transition, one of the points in the Repower EU, this plan to move away from Russian gas, is to have a European agenda about biomethane. And this is just because I've spent a week sitting in the Danish countryside, so I've seen a lot of cows and a few people. But that biomethane is actually a massive opportunity for agricultural regions to be part of the green transition as well. And you're talking then about creating good quality jobs, not necessarily massive numbers of jobs, but good quality jobs in rural areas. So a country like France Actually, biomethane is a really interesting way of combining the greening of the economy with an agricultural kind of focused rural economy. And then you have the circular economy. In Hungary, they want to be the world leader outside of China in batteries. That's their objective. And they are doing everything to attract investment into Hungary in terms of the battery plants. They have one of the first European working battery sites making EV batteries. That each country is looking at which part of the jigsaw puzzle they fit into. And I think if you think about Europe as a whole, then we can then be a leader as a region, because your point is absolutely right. Look at what's just happened in the US. The Biden administration, against all odds, got the climate legislation through. That is going to turbocharge a lot of investment in the US in terms of the same objectives. China has its 5-year plans. Their 5-year plans have been targeted at green tech for the last 15 years. And they are world dominating. But we know that if we don't catch some of this market, then we will become dependent on China. That's a political choice, a societal choice to make. But it means that if there's a future pandemic, if supply chains block, then we will see the same massive rise in prices, massive vulnerability in terms of our economy. So we need that production to be shared more globally. We need Europe to take part of the mix. And the Green Deal, Fit 55, the circular economy package, the Repower EU is actually a jigsaw puzzle to try and do that. But nobody's going to be the leader in that.
But just for a short, fairly short, because first of all, no.
I'm an ex-politician, I can just blather on, I apologise.
If Denmark is leading in wind and Norway in carbon capture...
And other stuff as well, I mean, I'm not...
Yeah. What is Eastern Europe going to be the leader in?
Well, you know, Poland also has an enormous potential in terms of renewables. And Poland is the, I think I'm going to make up a number, and now somebody's going to check on Google and tell me I'm wrong, but I think that they are within the top 5 producers of copper in the world. Copper is going to be an absolutely crucial material in a more electrified economy. They have a massive potential in the Silesian region in terms of raw materials and critical raw materials which are needed. So there are lots of potentials. What we're looking at with our Polish affiliates is actually miner to miner transitions.
So go from coal to copper.
It's much easier to talk to a Polish coal miner who likes his job that he'll turn into a copper miner than to convince them to become a wind operator. You know, you've got to think about what are the job qualities and the identities, because so much is cultural as well. Mining communities have a very specific culture. I come from a coal mining part of the northeast of England. There's a very specific culture in mining communities. Much easier to talk to people about moving from mining to mining than to talk about other things. So we need to be more imaginative. But there are lots of opportunities in different parts of Europe in terms of different parts of the Green Deal industries.
Søren, you had a comment?
Yeah, it was really just to back what you're saying, because I think there is a certain risk unless we act very, very much together here in Europe. I think there is a big risk that we will be losing out here. I'm absolutely convinced that the renewables area will be the main battle place for world domination in the years to come. And I think we are witnessing it already. And what I fear a bit is that we're a bit naive sometimes in Europe in this game. Whenever we are working in the US right now, working with all kinds of renewables projects, we are met by American clauses. By American clauses.
Okay, yeah.
So you basically, and I know if you go and talk to Vestas and guys like them, they know that in order to win a project in the US, they need to create a manufacturing site in the area where the wind farm is being built. And what we also see now, and that's the new part, if you go to Asia, if you go to Taiwan as an example, and you want to go for wind projects there, then you are met with very, very high demands for local content in the projects. In other words, it's nationalism, it's ways to make sure that you don't really are able to work as a global company, or at least you're left in a situation where you need to invest very, very heavily in the areas where you want to work.
But EU has been a story of lowering protectionism and lowering trade barriers.
Exactly.
And now we're seeing the opposite. What is that? What kind of obstacles does that present for you?
But the obstacles we're facing is not within the EU; it's outside of the EU. I think that's very important to say.
That's what I'm saying.
But as soon as we are going out to the world, we are met with a number of limitations, and we are met with a number of borders. And all I'm saying is, even though I believe very much in free trade, we also need to make sure that this is running both ways. So if we are allowing free trade for companies coming from the rest of the world, and we don't get the same arrangements when we try to engage in their markets, then it's not free trade. Then we're just in a situation where we're shooting ourselves in the leg. And I really think this is important. And therefore I think that the return of European industrial policy is actually the right way to go.
How do you see, just to follow up from what Judith was saying about Eastern Europe, and they are starting to focus on some of their competences. I don't know how engaged you are in that region, but is there any, because of that development that they are facing in the green transition, is there any threats or advantages that Danish companies or you have from that area that you can use?
But we are having a huge setup in Poland and Lithuania, but they are not working in the Polish or Lithuanian market. They are working in the markets outside of Poland and Lithuania, and the reasons are twofold. I'll have to be very honest here. They're twofold, but the most important one is that we are finding a number of very, very good and very, very dedicated colleagues in these countries. And the second one is that they're a bit cheaper than what we're finding in here. And the third one, I actually thought about that, is that there is an ample supply. So we are able to find good colleagues in Poland, Lithuania, and we are able to get more of them on board.
Is it getting harder to find them?
It's getting harder to find engineers everywhere in the world. Also in Poland, Lithuania. However, I'd still say it's easier to find a skilled engineer in Poland right now than it is to find one in Mariager or anywhere else in Denmark.
Laura, I remember a rule of thumb saying that if you have one engineer, it creates, I think it's 5 jobs for workers. How do you see this whole thing panning out in the future?
I actually think your question for Judith about the east of Europe, like what are they providing? What are they the leaders in? Right now we're talking a lot about like raw materials, and I know Judith knows a lot about raw materials. But one thing I think we might be forgetting is actually that with the green transition also comes digitalization, and maybe that's what they are actually really good at providing. And Søren also comments on this, that sometimes when you need skills like that, you go to Lithuania or Poland or even the Ukraine before the war. We need IT competences to do the green transition. So it's not all about where do the raw materials come from and how do we do that. It's also about like, how are we going to put everything together, and who's going to help us with doing that?
Judith, do you have?
Yeah. No, I think that's increasingly what we're seeing. I mean, we know that there are these enormous labour shortages, and one of the responses of industry will be increased digitalisation. Because, I mean, long term, we have to think about a context where the alternative would be mass immigration, and that demands a far broader social debate, which is very complicated in lots of countries. So the trade-off will probably be a question of digitalization. What we're seeing is that the green and digital transition used to be talked about separately as two separate processes, and now they are completely interbound with each other, and they're kind of mutually reinforcing each other in different places. So then there's a skills question about how you manage and you upskill and retrain the existing workforce, and we have an enormous upskilling and retraining issue in Europe. So I take, one of Europe's biggest industries, the automotive sector, employs 14 million people across the European Union. And we know that there needs to be upskilling and retraining of something like 2.4 million workers in the automotive sector in the next 5 years. In effect. I mean, this is colossal when you're talking about the change of an industry. So, but that's not just to deal with green tech. That's mostly as a result of digitalization and the introduction of digital skills. So we need to look at these two together. And what we saw during the pandemic was that in some parts of Europe, things advanced. And in other parts of Europe, the investment fell. So Eastern Europe isn't a single monolith. Some parts of Eastern Europe, there have been real collapses in investment in digitalization because the perception is workers are cheap, therefore digitalization, there's not the economic incentive. In other parts, and the Baltic countries would be a good example, the digitalization is seen as a national strategy, and that's been really promoted. So we shouldn't see, in these single blocks in a way. I guess the challenge, and here I really agree with you, Søren, the challenge of a European industrial policy will be about avoiding fragmentation in Europe. Because what we see at the moment with investment is it's flowing to Northwest Europe. Nearly all of the investment around the Green Deal is flowing to Northwest Europe. And that's where you need public policy to step in and to shift money into other areas. Because otherwise we'll end up with a twin track. And that's a real danger in terms of inequalities.
But the whole thing about training and lifelong learning and so on, I seem to remember the debate in Denmark for the past 20 years has been when times are good, companies are too busy to make money. When times are bad, they don't have the money to. So it's either way. How do you, from Laura and Judith from trade unions, see this thing? Are companies, Søren, you may answer afterwards, but are companies good enough to train the people that they need, or are they more focused on next year's budget?
I think a lot of, at least the bigger companies, it's part of the internal policy. At least that's what I've learned from working in Covi myself. But even when I worked here in the municipality of Mariager, it was part of a yearly plan for what you wanted to do with your professional life. I can't say how it is in the rest of Europe, but again, it kind of ends up with something that politicians can also have an opinion about. If they need a labor force that are skilled in the right direction, then they also need to look into how do we reskill them? What kind of demands do we put up for the companies, and what do we suggest for our citizens to do with their work life? I think politicians have a lot of power in that regard.
I think it's a real patchwork across Europe. So training and skills is a national issue in terms of European competences. And we've seen countries where there's been massive divestment in terms of education systems, training systems, and you end up in a situation where companies that do invest, then you create a negative. This is what happened in the UK, for example. We're not in the EU anymore, I apologize for that, but it's a good example. You used to have sectoral councils, training councils, which exist in quite a few European countries. Those were cut back through austerity measures and deregulation measures. And then the companies that invested in training, they would see their workers pinched by companies that didn't invest in training. So you end up with this disincentive in the companies to invest because your workers will be stolen by those who aren't making the long-term investments. That's why we really advocate the kind of agenda around sectoral frameworks where you avoid freeloaders and free riders, basically, because the scale of the challenge means that we can't afford to have those free riders, and the Scandinavian countries in general have always been a bit of an inspiration. I would say not always Denmark. Danes are very happy to be Danes, and that's lovely. But there's also inspiration in other Scandinavian countries, like in Sweden. They've just negotiated the first national interprofessional agreement for something like 40 years or so. That agreement is a just transition agreement. It's about it covers all workers across the whole economy, and it's created the possibility that workers can take up to a year as basically a training sabbatical, and to retrain and upskill within the framework with pay, with support. Now that's the kind of agenda which will be transformative. There are lots of interesting things happening in Sweden in terms of the economy, but that kind of agenda of linking up with the social dimension and the skills dimension is really putting together the industrial policy ambition of a country together with the ensuring that the workforce is there and has the skills that are needed. So I would encourage our Danish affiliates here in the room and also the interprofessional organizations to look at that Swedish agreement, because for us this is kind of best in class at the moment in terms of how you ensure that reskilling, upskilling program.
Søren, as a huge company, I'm sure that you already have big systems and programs in order to keep training your employees. How do you see in general the business sector being able to make sure that the workers they need tomorrow is trained today?
I think in general terms, most companies are taking this very, very seriously and have it high on the agenda. But I think your initial point was correct, that sometimes you are caught in the daily life, and when you are extremely busy, it may be that one of the things you tend to down prioritize a bit is the training exercises, and then it bites you in the butt when you're not that busy anymore, because then you may not have the right skilled people. I think that is very, very difficult to change in the individual company. But overall, I think most companies have it very high on the agenda. I think I don't know if that's true, but I have a sense that there may be differences here between highly educated and lower educated, and I think in general more money is being spent retraining people with higher education than ones with low education, which may in reality be not be the right way forward.
Laura, for a comment?
Yeah, just a quick comment is that, thank you for the good example from Sweden. Now I know what to fight for here in Denmark. But another thing that we notice is that the educational system doesn't always fit, for example, the green transition, because the educational system is old. It's been developed over many years, and in some ways it's just kind of a fixed system. It's not just something you change. And now that we want to reskill a lot of people, and we want them to like make a change in their life and do something completely different, that's not how the educational system has been thought out in the beginning. That was in a time where you were like, okay, so what do I want to be when I grow up? So I'll do this education, or I'll study this. And in that regard, we're still a little bit behind. And it's not because they don't want to cooperate or they don't want to make the courses that we suggest. It's just that the system doesn't really fit. So for them, it's kind of, I'm suggesting it as a win-win situation, and for them, it's kind of a lose-lose situation because they don't really get anything out of it because the point system don't match, the educators don't get the recommendations of what they've done in their professional lives and so on. So it's actually a little bit frustrating to go into that discussion because they want to help, but at the same time the system kind of doesn't allow them to help us out. So
we're running out of time. Just one question for each of you. Short answers. If we meet up here in 8 years, how close to the goal do you think we are? And what has been the most important factor in reaching that goal, starting with Judith?
I think, how close do I think? I think the next kind of few months are really going to be decisive as to how close we will be. I think when the winter hits, and the energy crisis really starts to bite, the danger is that people will start to focus on the short term, and they'll be so focused on the crisis that many people are going to feel a very deep purchasing power crisis, a very deep social crisis, and in some countries a massive increase in poverty. That I think that could then threaten the long-term objective. And I think the challenge is how we keep people's eyes on that long-term objective. So
we're going to be
I don't have a
crystal.
crystal ball, but I don't think that we're going to manage the Fit for 55 targets. I think they're the objective, but I would be surprised if we manage it. But as Søren said, if we hit 50% and we're heading in the right direction, then that means that the gradient towards 2050 is not as steep. So I think we need to recognize there has to be a bit of flexibility because of the current context. But I think it's going to be extremely, extremely hard the next 12 months.
Okay. Laura?
I very much agree with you, Judith, that right now it's really, really hard to see in which direction this is going to go. Are we going to give up a little bit for a while, or are we going to keep on fighting? We need to have politicians, both in a national sense and in a European level, to provide predictability right now. And it's hard to provide predictability in a world where we just had a pandemic and there's a war in Europe now. It's hard to be predictable because right now it seems that nothing is predictable. But at the same time, to support the development of infrastructure, research, skills at all levels, we need politicians to bring us that predictability, which is a really hard task. So, yeah, I'm not envious of them.
Søren?
Yeah, but I think we have to believe in it. I think if we don't believe in it, then it won't happen. So I think we need to say that these are the targets we've set. And I fully agree that the next 12 months are going to be tough. This winter is going to be, potentially a nightmare. I really hope for the hottest winter in Europe for the last 100 years. What's going to be important here, I think political leadership, as I said before, is going to be important. But I also think we are seeing some moves in the way consumers behave. and what they demand, in the way people, when they look for jobs, behave and what they demand, that will move the direction and will move society in the direction of increased sustainability. But I think all of us will fear the next 12 months.
Thank you so much, Judith, Laura, and Søren. Please give them a hand.